2 long years ago, very soon after the release of the game, I posted an analysis of God of War Ragnarok's story. I focused that analysis on the themes of fate and choice. How, in this story, prophecy is not defined by unchangeable destiny, but instead by choices. If a character is able to change, to make new choices, then they can subvert prophecy, which is exactly what both Kratos and Atreus eventually do. They forge a new and better path than the one destiny has laid out for them. Over the course of the last 2 years, I have played Ragnarok about 1,000 more times, and I have come to believe that fate is really only a secondary theme of the story. There is something bigger at play here that I missed the first time. The true primary theme of God of War Ragnarok is grief. Nearly every single character in this game is driven, at least partially, by grief, with 2 notable exceptions. The only characters in this story who seem immune to the destructive power of grief are Odin and Faye, both for very different reasons. But we will discuss them later. To begin, let's follow the first hour or so of the game and see where grief appears. In the opening scene, we see Kratos hunched over a fire alone in a cave. He pulls out this little pouch and sort of strokes it, feels it in his hands. He seems almost overwhelmed by his emotions for a moment, and then he recovers, puts it away, and begins sharpening an arrow shaft. We have seen this pouch before in the previous game. It held Faye's ashes throughout the entirety of God of War 4. During that game's story, Kratos refused to allow Atreus to even touch it until the very end of their journey together. He was very protective and possessive of it. It was the entire focus of his journey, to reach the highest peak in the realms, where she had requested her ashes to be scattered. To him, this pouch represents his love for his late wife, his affection for her, and much more importantly, everything he has lost since her death. Even now, all this time later, he still keeps the pouch with him at all times, a small reminder of her. And it is very important that he only pulls this out when he is alone. He does not want Atreus or anyone else to witness his grief, as if he is embarrassed by it or as if he views it as a weakness that he must hide. As I discussed in my last video, I believe Kratos is a character who was always driven by grief. Way back in the first game in the series, he unintentionally killed his own wife and daughter, and everything he did back then, all the rage and the violence and the destruction, was driven by his need to either erase or distract himself from that guilt, or to punish those he deemed responsible. I wonder if the reason why he hides his grief from others in the present is because he remembers what it has led him to do in the past, the monster it turned him into. He is trying to prevent himself from being consumed by his emotions again, to keep them bottled up. You can see the exact same thing in the opening scene of God of War 4, when he swings the axe at this marked tree. At first, his movements are steady and smooth, but then, for a single brief moment, he loses control of his emotions and is overcome by rage, roaring as he fells the tree in a single violent blow. It is his sorrow that led him to lose control there. But let's get back to Ragnarok. In this game's story, Kratos is not totally driven by his own grief. Instead, he is motivated by Atreus, by a potential future sorrow. And this is one of the most fascinating aspects of the way Ragnarok deals with the theme of grief. It is not just about what these characters have already lost, it is about what they are going to lose in the future too. At the end of the previous game, Kratos witnessed a prophecy predicting his own death, a prophecy he hid from his son. He claims to not believe in prophecy, but his actions suggest something else. In the time between the 2 games, he has been putting Atreus through a rigorous and exhaustive training regimen, and I think at least one of the reasons why he is doing that is because he wants to prepare his son for his death, for Atreus to be able to survive alone. This behavior has consequences. His relationship with his son is becoming strained. Atreus is chafing under this treatment, beginning to pull away, to hide things from his father. The more that Kratos refuses refuses to be honest about his true motivations and fears, the worse the conflict between them becomes. In God of War, grief has the power to destroy you before you have even actually lost anything. Just the fear of it alone is corrosive. This fear of future sorrow appears prominently in two other characters' storylines also. As we will see, both Atreus and Sindri are afflicted with very similar feelings with equally destructive results. But let's get back to the story. During Kratos and Atreus' return trip home from that cave, they are assaulted by Freya, another character driven by grief. She is still mourning the loss of her son Baldur, and that sorrow has transformed into a destructive rage. The only thing she cares about is hurting the man who she believes is responsible. She wants to make Kratos feel the same pain that she feels. After they escape, there is this final shot of her in the background, lying in the snow, screaming his name and howling with rage. She appears both insane and sort of pitiful here, a totally broken character, actually very similar to Kratos back when he was at his worst in the Greek games. In Freya's current circumstances, you can see the way that sorrow can break characters down, the way it has the power to completely consume them, to turn them into something far worse than they were before. In the previous game, Freya was a voice of reason, a source of stability, an emotionally mature and wise character who gave Kratos very valuable advice in navigating his relationship with his son. And now look at her, what she has devolved into. That is what grief does to characters in the God of War series. Next, we are going to watch part of the scene where Kratos and Atreus arrive back home. And as you watch, I want to ask you a question. How is grief being portrayed in this scene? What do the writers want you to feel about the effect grief has on these characters? And what is maybe kind of surprising about how that grief is being portrayed? Okay, here it is.
You're a good boy. A brave boy. Fast and strong. But you can rest now. Okay? I'll be okay. You can let go now. You have to let go. Sofna. Afra. Tesu. Sofna. Hethon. Sofna. Sofna. Sofna.
Directly after this, Kratos and his son get into a huge argument. They get angry, they shout at each other. Grief drives them straight into conflict. And then after that, Atreus becomes so sad and so angry that he loses control over his emotions. In the exact same way we just saw Freya lose control over her emotions. Except he also loses control of his body. Some kind of power awakens within him and he transforms into a bear. He goes on a rampage through the woods, killing the mother of these two cubs, which then dooms them to starvation and death. The fate of these bear cubs reveals the way that uncontrolled sorrow does not only hurt the person who feels that sorrow, it also has the power to destroy everything around them. This happened back in the Greek games too, when Kratos' feelings of sadness and guilt and rage led him to rampage through Mount Olympus, killing god after god after god until Greece was left a devastated, broken wasteland. But let's rewind a little bit back to that scene we watched together. There was something surprising there, right? Within Atreus' grief, something genuinely beautiful and unexpected occurred. He speaks these strange ritual words and draws Fenrir's soul from his body. These little sprites float through the air while the sound of a chorus swells in the background. Within his grief, something else has awakened within Atreus. Another new power he did not know he had. This is the writers showing us that despite all the pain, the anger, the sadness, it is possible for beauty and creation to arise out of sorrow too. There is another side to this. Unfortunately, the characters do not understand this yet or cannot accept it. It is going to take them basically the entire game to learn how to deal with their grief in a healthier way. Soon after this scene, Thor arrives at their cabin. This is something I discussed way back in my analysis of his character, but Thor is portrayed in a very unexpected way in this scene. Previously, other characters described Thor as this raging, violent monster who was constantly drunk, constantly getting into fights, uncontrollable, destroying everyone and everything around him. But despite his fearsome reputation, the Thor who arrives at their cabin is subdued, quiet, and even soft-spoken. Perhaps most shocking of all, he is sober. He refuses to drink. In Norse mythology, Thor's drinking is as legendary as his fighting. Between games, this character has transformed in a really profound way. And of course, it is all about grief. In the previous game, his sons, Magni and Modi, were killed. Just before Modi's death, Thor beat him bloody in a drunken rage. That is the last interaction he ever had with his son, and you can tell that he is filled with shame and regret. But there is something else here too. He is trying to be better. He stopped drinking at least partly so he could be a better father to his only surviving child, Thrud. Once again, the writers are showing us that sorrow has the power to do more than just destroy. It is all a question of how we respond to that sorrow, whether we allow it to break us down. Of course, this is something Thor struggles with throughout the entire game, and he never totally conquers his own demons. Next, let's talk about Sindri, another character completely defined by grief. Once upon a time, his brother Brock died in an accident. Sindri was so utterly incapable of managing his grief in a healthy way that in the end, he refused to allow himself to feel it at all. In an incredible and dangerous act, he dove into the Lake of Souls and carried his brother's soul back home. This choice has dire consequences. Sindri's mission was partially a failure, and when Brock dies again, his soul is unable to find its way back to the lake. Sindri's inability to manage his grief back then has caused his brother to be denied an afterlife in the present. And as I discussed previously, it is not just about what Sindri has already lost, it is also about what he fears he will lose in the future. Early on in the game, Sindri states that he feels he must protect the people he cares about to keep bad things from happening to them. He is not really doing this for them, he is doing it for himself. He is trying to prevent himself from having to feel grief again. This fear causes him to become controlling, overprotective, overcautious, neurotic, and uptight. In some ways, he gets so wound up that it prevents him from really being able to truly enjoy or appreciate the time he does have with those people he cares about. And of course, when Brock actually does die again, Sindri is completely devastated. His whole personality is shattered. He is more broken than perhaps any other character in the entire series. He undergoes a complete transformation, where before he was generous and friendly and silly, he becomes angry, bitter, resentful, cynical, and nihilistic. Sindri's story is meant to show the audience an extreme example of someone who is never able to learn how to let go. This is the future that awaits all of our characters until they can learn this lesson. Next, we are going to watch the scene where Atreus finally does see that prophecy his father hid from him. And as you watch, once again, ask yourself, how are his feelings of grief being portrayed here? What do those feelings lead him to do? Okay, here it is.
No. No. It's not right. That can't be what happens. no. No, this isn't real. Ironwood's not real. Ungar's not real. None of this is real. Ah!
Hey! Whoa, you're okay. You're okay. It's all alright. It'll be okay. Look at me. Hey.
As soon as Atreus learns that his father may die, he loses all control. Not just over his emotions, but once again, over his body too. He transforms into a wolf. He rages and tears at the mural containing the prophecy with his claws. He cannot imagine, even for a moment, accepting the loss of his father. He refuses to even consider it. In some ways, everything he does after this point is an attempt to reassert control. When he goes to Asgard, enters the service of Odin, when he tries to trick Odin and steal the mask, when he joins the Battle of Ragnarok, it is all him trying to take control of the situation, to prevent the death of his father. It is all driven by a fear of future grief, by a refusal to accept even the possibility of loss. You can see this theme appear in the storylines of a lot of other characters too. Angerboda is clearly still mourning the loss of her parents, and so is her grandmother. Mimir still feels some grief and regret over some of the things he did while in Odin's service. I think you could also argue that Heimdall is driven by a fear of future grief too. For all his flaws, he is trying to prevent the destruction of Asgard, his home. He is trying to save lives, even if he's going about it in a completely stupid and arrogant way. Throughout all of these examples, grief has been portrayed as a destructive force. It has the power to break these characters down, to turn them into their worst selves, to make them bitter and angry and violent. It causes them to lose control, to lash out at those around them, to hurt the people they care about most. Trying to flee from grief or prevent it from ever happening in the first place only leads to even worse outcomes. Sorrow is inevitable. You are always going to lose someone or something eventually. It cannot be stopped. In this story, grief seems terrifying. It is a more dangerous antagonist than either Zeus or Odin ever were. It causes far more harm than even the most powerful of tyrannical gods. So what is the answer? What can these characters do? Is there no hope? Are they all doomed to fall to the destructive power of grief, to be made broken and miserable when they inevitably lose someone they care about? Well, maybe not. As I mentioned earlier, there are two characters in this story who appear remarkably unaffected by the destructive effects of grief. These are characters who are so different from each other that they otherwise have nothing else in common. They are polar opposites. They are Odin and Faye. So we're going to start with Odin. We're going to watch part of his first scene in the game when he discusses the deaths of Magni, Modi, and Balder. As you watch, consider this question. How is the portrayal of Odin's grief different than every single other character we have seen so far? How does his character respond to sorrow? Okay, here it is.
Back before winter set in, there were some misunderstandings. Regrettable ones. But I think we all have a better idea of who we're dealing with. Now, what you did to his boys. Self-defense. Dying is what we Aesir live for. And let's be honest, they were kinda useless. But Balder, he had value. He was my best tracker, my closer. Yeah, his mind was gone, sure. But he had his uses, and now he's gone because of you. You follow me? You have a debt. You're no fun anymore.
The difference between Odin and every single other character in this story is that he does not appear to feel any grief or sorrow whatsoever. He never expresses a single ounce of sadness over the loss of Magni, Modi, or Balder. In the case of Magni and Modi, he just dismisses them, as if their lives never even mattered. In the case of Balder, he does express a certain regret, not because he actually cared about him, but because, in his own words, Balder had value. Not emotional value or sympathetic value, but practical value. Balder was a tool, a very effective tool. And while Odin might not care about losing a family member, you better believe he is going to be upset about losing a good tool. We see the same lack of grief after the deaths of both Heimdall and Thor. He just does not seem to care about other people. He is a sociopath. This is the other end of the extreme, whereas a character like Sindri cares so much about other people that his grief utterly ruins him. A character like Odin cares so little that he is never touched by grief at all. Neither of these extremes are presented in a positive light. If anything, Odin's complete lack of grief is portrayed as even worse. He is a monster. There must be some other way, some better way to deal with the problem of grief. And that is where Faye comes in. We are going to watch the scene where she discusses her own future death. As you watch, once again ask yourself, how is her character's response to grief different from every other character we have seen so far? Is her response any better or healthier, and if so, why? Okay, here it is.
Death is a natural part of life, my love. I wish only to be prepared for when my time comes. We mortals must do such things. I am glad to have you prepare with me. You are quiet?
I have nothing to say.
Well, say something. I enjoy hearing your voice.
A funeral pyre. I would have chosen different.
Oh?
In my land, we entomb our loved ones.
You would have me trapped in the ground for eternity.
I would have you close to me.
How touching. My rotting corpse would bring you such comfort. You once tried to take charge of your ending, did you know?
That was different.
Circumstance, yes. But not on purpose.
You prepare for a distant future. There is much time ahead of us.
I wish to better a future that will exist without me, whenever that day comes. For you and for our son. We will always walk together, Kratos. You will always be a part of me. I will always be a part of you.
And when you are gone, that part of me dies as well. Faye, you feel your absence.
Culmination of love is grief. And yet we love, despite the inevitable. We open our hearts to it.
Unlike nearly every other character in the game, Faye maintains control over her emotions even in the face of death and grief. The mere possibility of grief does not cause her to fly into an uncontrolled rage the way we saw it do to Atreus, and it does not cause her to become overly controlling and overprotective the way we saw it do to Sindri. And unlike Odin, it is not because she does not care. In fact, Faye feels very strong emotions. Notice at the beginning of this scene when she presses her hand against the tree, and she sort of pauses for a moment, has to gather herself. For the briefest moment, she was a little overwhelmed by her emotions, but unlike every other character, she is able to take a deep breath, collect herself, and keep pushing forward. Even in this scene, Kratos is still trying to hide from it. Notice when he says, "You prepare for a distant future. There is much time ahead of us." That is him expressing, hey, we don't have to deal with this right now. We don't have to start preparing for loss already. I do not want to think about this. And this is a very common emotional response. We all do this. Let's just put it off. Let's not talk about death now. Let's not spoil the time we have by thinking about unpleasant things. But Kratos is wrong. The unfortunate fact is that if we wait to prepare for loss until death has already happened, then it will be too late. The point Faye makes is that we need to prepare for loss now, early, because it is coming and it is going to hurt. The alternative path Faye offers is acceptance. She acknowledges the inevitability of death and loss openly and honestly. She does not hide her feelings, and she does not run from those feelings. Instead, she prepares both herself and her loved ones for it. She clearly communicates her wishes. Through this preparation, she is maintaining a sense of control over her death. That is the whole purpose of death rituals, to provide a stable and solid framework through which we can manage our otherwise unstable emotions through a very difficult period. But it is not just about her funeral or her feelings. It is also about the world that will continue to go on even after she's gone. As she says, I wish to better a future that will exist without me. She wants to prepare the people she cares about for her absence. In some ways, it is exactly the same thing Kratos is trying to do by training and training and training with Atreus. But the difference is that he is not able to be honest about why he is doing it, and that is why his approach leads to conflict. Next, notice the way Kratos becomes miserable just at the suggestion of her death. How he is already unable to cope, even years before it has actually happened. This is the unhealthy way to deal with grief. This is how it destroys. Then Faye responds with the line, "The culmination of love is grief." This is not an original idea. This has been expressed by a million different people in a million different ways. That the only ones who have the privilege of not experiencing grief are miserable, lonely assholes like Odin. People who experience deep grief are those who have loved deeply. Whenever you fall in love, grief comes along for the ride. It's just part of the deal. You either have to stop falling in love or else find some way to deal with that grief. And Faye is offering both Kratos and the audience with a way to do that. Acceptance, openness, and honesty are the path to defanging the destructive power of grief. You have to talk about it with the people you love. You have to be honest about your feelings. You have to prepare in advance. You cannot wait until it happens. I think this is a far more poignant, profound, and meaningful theme than any other that appears in this game's story. The ugly truth is that everyone will face grief eventually, and none of us want to be destroyed by it the way so many characters in this series are. For example, imagine how things would have been different if Brock and Sindri had been able to have an open and honest conversation about what Sindri had done and what was going to happen when Brock eventually died. Imagine if Sindri had been able to prepare himself for that possibility without freaking out, without trying to control everything. The outcome might have been very different. And that is the end of my better story analysis of God of War Ragnarok. In some ways, I think this game is finally resolving a theme that has been at the center of the series since the very first game. The character of Kratos has always needed a healthier way to deal with his grief, something better than guilt and shame and rage and violence. And with Faye, someone has finally presented him with a better path forward. I don't know what the future of God of War is, but with this resolution, I do think Ragnarok could serve as a really effective conclusion to the entire series. If this was the last God of War game, I think I would be okay with that. If there ever is another game, and of course there almost certainly will be eventually, that new game is going to have to find some new central theme to base the story around. something totally different for the characters to grapple with, because the theme of grief is done. Before I end this video, I should talk a little bit about what the future of this channel is. It has been 2 years since the release of Ragnarok, and I have been pretty consistently uploading God of War video essays ever since. But I do think I'm coming close to exhausting the topics that are left to be explored in the Norse games. For a while now, I have been gearing up to do a retrospective series on the old Greek games. I want to do a set of really extensive videos that dig into what made those games so special, analyze how their stories were written, examine how the series evolved over time, and of course do videos on every single villain, from Ares all the way to Zeus. I'm honestly really excited about it, and I hope some of the people who enjoy these videos about the Norse games will be willing to come along for the ride too. But before I move on, I do feel like I need to tie up a couple loose ends. For example, I have never done a video on Atreus. I don't know how that's possible, but I haven't. I also feel like in order to achieve my goal of writing an essay about every single villain in the series, I need to do a video on Magni and Modi, and also I think Gryla, Angerboda's grandmother, probably deserves a short villain video as well. So in the next few weeks, I'm going to post a handful more videos about the 2 Norse games, and then I'm going to finally dive into the Greek games, go back to where it all started, with the 2005 release of God of War on the PlayStation 2.